Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. immigration officials, financial regulators, and legal experts had feared, tracked, and quietly prepared for. A rule that unfolded not over years of legislative debate, but in a single policy shift. A shift that changed the way millions of immigrant families send money home. A shift that put everyday people under federal scrutiny without warning. A shift that could separate families, freeze accounts, and trigger ICE involvement, all from a single wire transfer. What the federal government did today crossed a line that immigrant rights advocates had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, communities across America did not hesitate. They responded with alarm, with questions, and with an urgent need for answers. For months now, there had been signals, not from mainstream headlines, not from official press releases, just quiet signals, that federal agencies were preparing something unusual. The Treasury Department has been aggressive, yes, but they have been unusually coordinated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in immigrant communities and legal circles this spring was that the usual warning signs went silent. Lawyers who monitor remittance policy know the indicators, the pre-rule commentary periods, the advocacy group alerts, the congressional briefings, the slow build of public pressure. All of that went quiet. And whenever federal agencies go quiet on a policy that affects millions of people, it means something is about to get very loud. Early this year, financial compliance analysts detected what they described as a significant tightening of Bank Secrecy Act enforcement, including reporting thresholds and cross-referencing protocols that had not been applied this broadly in over a decade. These are the kinds of regulatory mechanisms that federal agencies only deploy when they are signaling something very specific. Increased surveillance of financial flows, preparation for enforcement actions, or both simultaneously. Legal observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the federal government was changing its posture on remittances. And when a government shifts its posture on money transfers without clear public explanation, even by a small measure, every immigration attorney in the country pays attention. Here is what you need to understand right now. If you are an immigrant living in the United States, documented or undocumented, and you send money home to your family, there is a new federal threshold that you must know about. The number is $10,000. Not $10,000 in a single transfer. $10,000 in cumulative transfers within a rolling period. Once your remittances cross that threshold, financial institutions are legally required to file what is called a Currency Transaction Report, or CTR, with the federal government. That report goes to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, which sits inside the Treasury Department. And FinCEN shares data. It shares it with the IRS, it shares it with the Department of Homeland Security. And in 2026, under the current administration's expanded cooperation agreements, it shares flagged reports with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. The warning issued by immigration legal experts tonight was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Attorney after attorney described this policy shift as sweeping, dangerous, and, perhaps most importantly, deliberately obscured from the communities most affected by it. The rule itself is not new. The Bank Secrecy Act has required currency transaction reporting since 1970, but what is new is the enforcement context. What is new is the data-sharing architecture between financial regulators and immigration enforcement. What is new is that in 2026, A $10,000 remittance pattern no longer just triggers a financial compliance review. It can now trigger an immigration status review. The combination is what makes this moment so different from anything that came before. Let's break down exactly how this works, because the details matter. When you send money internationally, through a wire transfer, a money service business like Western Union or Remitly, a bank transfer, or even certain mobile apps, that transaction is logged. If your transactions in a given period total $10,000 or more, a currency transaction report is automatically filed. But here is the part that most people don't know. There is a second mechanism called Suspicious Activity Reports, or SARs. Banks and money transmitters are required to file SARs not just when you hit $10,000, but whenever a pattern of transactions seems designed to avoid the $10,000 threshold. This is called structuring. If you send $9,000 one week and $8,000 the next, that pattern can be flagged as structuring, which is itself a federal crime, regardless of whether the money is entirely legitimate. And a SAR filing, unlike a CTR, does not require notification to the sender. You will never know it was filed. But ICE might. Tonight, legal sources confirmed that immigration enforcement agencies have been cross-referencing FinCEN data with immigration databases, including records from the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, visa holder registries, and asylum applicant files. People who thought their financial activity was private are now discovering that it forms part of a searchable federal profile. People who sent money home to a sick parent, to a child in school, to a sibling rebuilding after a natural disaster, those transfers are now data points in a system that was not built to serve them. This is what made advocates' warning so urgent. The $10,000 rule wasn't just a financial compliance mechanism, it was now an actionable immigration enforcement tool. It represented the kind of policy convergence that could upend lives if left unchallenged. And here is where the story becomes even more serious. Intelligence from inside federal agencies now suggests that the current enforcement posture was specifically designed to test the financial behavior of undocumented and mixed status households after years of reduced interior enforcement under previous administrations. The federal government wanted to see whether immigrant families would continue sending remittances at high volumes without triggering scrutiny. Instead, the opposite is now happening. Advocates didn't stay silent. Community organizations didn't advise people to simply stop sending money. They responded with legal guidance that was so precise, so immediately distributed, that it reached tens of thousands of families within days. Immigration attorneys speaking with community media under anonymity described the administration's strategy as a quiet dragnet, a way to build immigration enforcement cases through financial data rather than traditional field operations. But advocates proved that communities remain both informed and resilient. As reports continued coming in throughout this week, we learned more about the scale of what is actually happening. Advocacy organizations carried out emergency legal briefings in Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, New York, and Miami, forcing a public conversation that federal agencies had hoped to avoid. Community finance educators targeted remittance service providers that had recently updated their compliance reporting structures in alignment with DHS data sharing agreements. Legal aid networks operating across state lines reportedly began advising clients on transaction structuring laws and legal alternatives used by mixed-status families to send funds abroad. This wasn't just a financial regulation story. This wasn't just an immigration story. This was a convergence of both, a moment where the apparatus of financial surveillance became, deliberately and by design, the apparatus of immigration enforcement. And that convergence is the one thing that immigrant communities have struggled to prepare for since enforcement priorities shifted in January. Remember, federal officials thought immigrant families wouldn't know the threshold. They thought remittance senders wouldn't understand the data sharing pipeline. They thought the legal complexity of Bank Secrecy Act compliance would keep affected communities from organizing a coherent response. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Communities are organizing. Attorneys are publishing plain language guides. Spanish language, Tagalog language, Hindi language, and Arabic language explainers are circulating on every platform. The federal government's assumption that regulatory complexity would serve as a shield against public scrutiny has been wrong. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that this policy shift happened at a time when the current administration is under enormous pressure from multiple directions. Hardline immigration enforcement factions want mass deportation infrastructure built and used. Business lobbies want undocumented labor pools maintained. Foreign governments receiving remittances want financial flows protected. Civil liberties organizations want constitutional challenges filed. The administration is balancing these demands while simultaneously pursuing the most aggressive interior enforcement posture in a generation. And when administrations in that position make sudden, quiet moves, they are not doing it from a position of unified strength. They are doing it from political pressure. They are doing it from internal contradiction. They are doing it from the vulnerability of trying to satisfy every faction at once. The guidance issued by the American Immigration Lawyers Association this week, now circulating widely across community networks, was designed to signal that the legal community is not willing to allow financial surveillance to become a de facto deportation pipeline without a public fight. Legal advocates said plainly that the administration's use of FinCEN data for immigration enforcement purposes is inconsistent with the original legislative intent of the Bank Secrecy Act. That is careful legal language for, this was never supposed to work this way, and we intend to challenge it. You do not usually hear that tone from established legal organizations unless something constitutionally significant is at stake. Meanwhile, immigrant community leaders address their constituencies in direct, urgent, and unflinching terms this week. They said, "Do not stop supporting your families, but understand the system you are operating inside." They said, $10,000 is the number and you need to know it. And they said, your financial behavior is now immigration data, and you have a right to make informed decisions about it. These are not rhetorical warnings. These are statements from communities that understand just how high the stakes have actually become. Here is what makes the situation even more concerning. The $10,000 threshold is not the only mechanism in play. Along with the CTR reporting requirement, money service businesses have also increased their voluntary SAR filing rates as part of federal compliance audits. Major banking institutions quietly updated their terms of service to reflect expanded data sharing obligations with DHS. And federal prosecutors have increased structuring prosecutions, specifically targeting remittance patterns in cities with large undocumented populations. All of this happened within the same 6-month window. When a federal government moves multiple enforcement mechanisms simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. It means the individual pieces are designed to work together. Legal analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the administration is preparing a large-scale financial data-driven deportation initiative targeting high-volume remittance senders. Another is that the administration is attempting to use the threat of financial surveillance to deter undocumented immigration by making economic life inside the United States less viable. A third possibility, the one worrying civil liberties attorneys the most, is that the administration is attempting to build prosecutable structuring cases against undocumented individuals as a pathway to criminal removal rather than civil deportation, bypassing certain due process protections. But today, community legal networks took that card, at least partially, off the table. They didn't stay silent. They didn't wait for a court ruling. They didn't hope the policy would be reversed quietly. They organized. What we are watching now is a test of institutional transparency. The federal government wants to see whether financial surveillance can function as an invisible deportation tool. Immigrant communities want to show that informed legal engagement can disrupt that mechanism. Civil liberties organizations want to prevent financial data from becoming a permanent immigration enforcement infrastructure. And foreign governments, many of which depend on remittance flows for a significant portion of national GDP, want to prevent the United States from weaponizing money transfer systems against their citizens living abroad. Tonight, we have heard from legal experts who are now monitoring federal court dockets for early constitutional challenges to the FinCEN-DHS data sharing arrangement. They say the legal theory is viable. They say the political will to file is building. And they say the administration's decision to expand remittance surveillance is likely part of a broader deterrent strategy intended to reshape the economic calculus of undocumented life in America. But immigrant communities are not retreating. In fact, they are engaging with greater urgency than at any point in recent memory. Their response this week, organized, legally grounded, and rapidly distributed, sent a message to federal enforcement agencies that this community sees the mechanism, and it sent a message to the courts and to Congress that this issue will not remain invisible. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the administration hoped to achieve by quietly expanding FinCEN-DHS cooperation. But what we do know is that the legal community's rapid response was timely. It reached communities before enforcement actions could quietly accumulate. It armed people with the specific numbers, the specific mechanisms, and the specific legal rights they need to protect themselves. And it forced a public conversation that federal agencies had counted on avoiding. What happens next will depend on what the administration does in the next 60 days. If they back down from aggressive data sharing enforcement, this moment will be remembered as a community organizing success that stopped a policy before it could destroy lives. If they escalate, advocates, attorneys, and federal courts have already shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they are ready to fight. And tonight, for the first time in years, the intersection of financial regulation and immigration enforcement appears to be fully visible to the communities it was designed to target. Washington is not quiet on this. Too much is now public. And when a quiet federal policy becomes loud, it means communities are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, immigrant families across America learned something that the federal government hoped they would never piece together, that the wire transfer you sent last month is now a data point in an immigration file, that the $10,000 threshold is not just a banking rule, it is a surveillance threshold, and that in 2026, financial compliance and immigration enforcement are no longer separate systems. They are the same system. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Communities that are informed cannot be quietly swept up. Rights that are known cannot be silently stripped away. And a policy that steps into the light can be challenged, contested, and changed. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.